It was just a phone call. No warning, no urgency, no sense that it would matter more than any other. Elvis Presley let it ring. He didn't ignore it out of cruelty. He didn't ignore it because he didn't care. He ignored it because he was tired and because he believed there would be time later. There wasn't. Stay with us until the end. Because this story reveals a night Elvis Presley made a small decision that followed him quietly for the rest of his life. The room was loud, not with music, but with people, voices overlapping, laughter, glasses clinking, the low hum of a television. Nobody was really watching. Elvis sat slightly apart from it all, sinking into a couch that felt softer than it should have. It had been a long day, not physically exhausting, emotionally draining. Meetings, smiles, conversations where everyone wanted something, and no one really asked how he was doing. Elvis loosened his collar and leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the noise wash over him. Then the phone rang. Once. He didn't react. Phones rang constantly. Requests, updates, messages passed through layers of people before reaching him. Most of the time, they weren't for him at all, just about him. The phone rang again. Someone across the room glanced at it. "You want me to get that, E?" Elvis opened his eyes briefly and looked toward the sound. The phone sat on a small table near the wall, vibrating slightly with each ring. He shook his head. "Nah." The ringing stopped. Conversation resumed. Elvis leaned forward, rubbing his face with one hand. He didn't feel relief, just delay. A few minutes passed. The phone rang again. This time, something about it felt different. Not louder, not more urgent, just persistent in a way that cut through the noise. Elvis stared at it longer now. For a second, he considered standing up. Then someone said his name. Someone asked him something trivial. Someone laughed too loud. The phone stopped ringing. Elvis didn't think much of it after that. That was a mistake. Because some calls don't demand attention. They wait for it. Elvis didn't find out who had called until much later. Not that night. Not even the next morning. The call disappeared into the same mental drawer where he kept 1,000 other unfinished moments. Unopened letters, postponed decisions. Conversations he told himself he'd return to when things slowed down. Things never slowed down. The next day arrived, already full. Schedules stacked on top of each other. Cars waiting. People talking before he had time to think. The phone rang again and again. Different voices, different reasons. But not that one. It wasn't until days later, in a quiet hallway between obligations, that someone mentioned it casually. "By the way," a voice said, almost as an afterthought, "there was a call the other night. Came in late. They said it was important." Elvis paused mid-step. "From who?" he asked. The answer came slower than it should have. "From home." The word landed softly and still managed to knock the air out of him. Home meant very few people. Family, old friends, things untouched by contracts and handlers. Elvis felt a faint tightening in his chest. What did they want? The person shrugged. Didn't say much. Just asked if you were around. Elvis nodded, forcing his face to remain neutral. All right. But the hallway felt longer after that. That night, alone again, Elvis thought about the call for the first time without distraction. He tried to remember the sound of the phone ringing. How many times, how long he'd waited before deciding not to move. He couldn't. That bothered him more than it should have. He picked up the receiver and dialed the number he knew by heart. It rang and rang. No answer. Elvis hung up and told himself it was nothing. But something about the silence on the other end felt heavier than the ringing ever had. Elvis didn't talk about the call. Not because he was hiding it, but because he didn't know how to frame it without giving it weight. And giving it weight meant admitting it mattered. So he carried it quietly. Days passed. Then weeks. Life surged forward the way it always did, relentless and efficient. Shows, travel, smiles on demand. Elvis became very good at being present everywhere, except inside his own thoughts. But silence has a way of answering back. Late at night, in hotel rooms that felt interchangeable, Elvis found himself staring at the phone more than he used to. He told himself it was habit, that it meant nothing. It meant something. He'd dial home again. This time, Someone answered. The voice was familiar, softer than he remembered, cautious in a way that immediately set him on edge. "Hello. It's me," Elvis said. There was a pause. Not long, just enough. "Oh," the voice replied. "We didn't know when you'd call." Elvis sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. "I heard y'all tried to reach me," he said. "Yes," the voice answered. "We did." Another pause. What was it about? Elvis asked. The answer didn't come right away. "Well," the voice said carefully, "it was just we wanted to talk to you." Just talk. Elvis nodded even though they couldn't see him. "All right," he said. "I'm here now." But the tone had changed. Whatever urgency had existed before had faded. Not into anger, but into acceptance. The kind that forms when you stop expecting something to happen. They spoke for a few minutes. About nothing important. About weather. About small things that didn't require vulnerability. When the call ended, Elvis stayed sitting there, phone still in his hand. He understood something then that unsettled him deeply. The call hadn't been missed because he ignored it. It had been missed because the moment it belonged to had passed. And moments don't wait for permission to leave. Elvis found out on a morning that looked ordinary. No dramatic setup. No warning that this would be the day everything shifted. He was halfway through breakfast when the conversation drifted back to home, the way it often did, casually, without intention. Someone mentioned a visit. Someone else mentioned the hospital. Elvis froze. "Hospital?" he asked too quickly. The room went quiet. The answer came carefully, like something fragile being handed across a table. "They didn't want to worry you," the voice said. "That's why they called." Elvis set his fork down slowly. That was it. That was what the call had been. Not a crisis. Not an emergency. A moment of fear that someone wanted to share before it became something worse. A need to hear his voice. "They were scared," the person continued. "Didn't know what the doctors were going to say yet." Elvis nodded, his face still, his chest tightening. He remembered the ringing phone, the way it blended into the noise, the decision to stay seated, to rest, to assume there would be time later. Later had arrived carrying information instead of connection. "They're okay now," the voice added quickly, trying to soften the blow. Elvis smiled faintly. "That's good." But relief didn't come, because what haunted him wasn't what had happened. It was what almost did. That call had been a doorway, not into tragedy, but into closeness. A chance to be present when presence mattered, even if nothing went wrong. Elvis realized then that not every regret is born from loss. Some are born from realizing you were needed and didn't know it. He pushed his plate away, appetite gone. For the rest of the day, Elvis moved through his schedule like a man underwater. Smiles came late. Answers were short. People noticed, but no one asked. And Elvis didn't explain. Because how you explain missing something that never officially happened? The call didn't haunt Elvis the way people imagine regret does. It didn't scream. It didn't replay itself endlessly in his mind. It settled, quietly, like something placed on a shelf you walk past every day, pretending not to see, until one day you realize it's changed the way you move through the room. Elvis noticed it first in small moments. The phone rang, and instead of waving away, he watched it, not with urgency, with attention, as if the sound itself now carried weight. He started asking, "Who was that?" Started saying, "Hold on, let me take this." Started stepping out of rooms, instead of letting the noise decide for him. No one commented on the change. They just adjusted around it. But inside, Elvis knew. He thought about how easy it had been to assume that important things would announce themselves loudly. Emergencies, crises, clear warnings. That call had taught him something else. Sometimes what matters most sounds ordinary. It comes without urgency because the person on the other end is trying not to be a burden. That realization stayed with him on stage, too. Between songs, when fans shouted requests, Elvis found himself listening past the noise, scanning for tone instead of volume. Not every voice needed answering, but some needed acknowledging. He remembered the calm voice on the other end of the phone. The way it hadn't demanded him. That was the danger. Elvis realized that love often hides inside politeness. Inside, whenever you have time. Inside, no rush. Inside, we just wanted to hear you. One night, after another long show, Elvis returned to his room and picked up a phone before sitting down. He dialed home. No reason. No update. Just to hear a voice before sleep replaced intention again. When someone answered, surprised but pleased, Elvis smiled. "I ain't calling for nothing," he said. "Just wanted to check in." That was when he felt it. Not relief. Alignment. Because the call he'd ignored hadn't asked for rescue. It had asked for presence. And Elvis was finally learning the difference. Elvis never learned exactly what would have happened if he had answered that night. And over time, he understood that this was the point. If the call had ended in tragedy, the regret would have been loud, obvious, explainable. People would have understood it. They would have wrapped it in sympathy and allowed it to become a story with an ending. But it didn't. The call ended in silence. And silence has no edges. It doesn't close. It stays open, asking nothing while demanding everything. Years later, Elvis could still remember the sound of that phone ringing. Not clearly, not precisely, but emotionally. The feeling of it blending into the room. The way he'd chosen comfort over interruption. The way the decision had felt harmless. That was what stayed with him. Because the call hadn't been ignored out of selfishness. It had been ignored out of exhaustion. And exhaustion, he learned, is dangerous precisely because it makes ordinary choices feel justified. Elvis began to recognize that pattern elsewhere in his life. Moments postponed. Conversations delayed. Feelings acknowledged later. Later became the most expensive word he knew. The unanswered call became a quiet reference point. Not something he spoke about, but something he measured himself against. Whenever he felt the instinct to delay, to assume time would wait, he thought of that ringing phone. And sometimes he answered because of it. Not every time. Not perfectly. But differently. He understood now that being needed doesn't always arrive with urgency. Sometimes it arrives gently, trusting that you'll notice. That trust was what he had failed once. He wouldn't fail it every time. One night, long after the call had become memory instead of event, Elvis sat alone in a quiet room, phone resting on the table beside him. It wasn't ringing. He picked it up anyway, not to correct the past, not to relieve guilt, but to stay awake to the present. The call he ignored never left him, not as punishment, but as awareness, a reminder that love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just rings,